I was originally supposed to give this lecture just a few days before lockdown began. My response to the question, what is hope, was occasioned by Westminster Abbey Institute's broader programme of public lectures and a symposium on this theme for public servants. The Charles Gore lecture had just been given by Professor Jürgen Moltmann, whose work on a theology of hope had been so formative for generations of theologians and philosophers far beyond the English-speaking world. At the forefront of my mind when planning the lecture was this year's 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. As we'll see, hope is a very difficult topic to consider in the abstract, and a remarkable degree of exceptionally moving writing on this subject emerged from the horrors of the Holocaust. Hope often emerges in a very distilled form from within contexts where it seems most logically absent. Since this March, the world's broader context has changed immeasurably. Our global public health crisis has introduced a new kind of fellowship which doesn't respect borders or national identity, whilst simultaneously laying bare, indeed increasing, some of the inequalities and injustices which have already characterized the 21st century. Over the last months, gallons of ink has been spilt, picking apart the sociological, geopolitical, and theological implications of COVID-19. Pandemics, whilst always tragic, come and go. In a world where so frequently humans or their technology have seemed to be on an unstoppable advance, to be undone by nature on such a scale is shocking to many. However, the realization that humanity is part of a dynamic, interdependent creation rather than separate from it, and bound together in societies where our own survival might be dependent on those to whom ordinarily we might not think we owe much debt, might ultimately enable us to become more hopeful. But to get us thinking, a couple of sentences from one of the most important works to explore the theme of hope of the last 15 years. Our daily efforts in pursuing our own lives and in working for the world's future either tire us or turn us into fanaticism, unless we're enlightened by the radiance of the great hope that cannot be destroyed even by small-scale failures or by a breakdown in matters of historic importance. If we cannot hope for more than is effectively attainable at any given time, or more than is promised by political or economic authorities, our lives will soon be without hope. It is important to know that I can always continue to hope, even if in my own life or the historical period in which I am living, there seems to be nothing left to hope for. Pope Benedict XVI's encyclical Spe Salvi developed the Christian concept of hope as it is linked to faith, indeed in some ways interchangeable with it. I begin here not because this is primarily a lecture on Christian catechesis, but simply to make 2 points. First, that hope is always hope in something or someone. No matter how else we define it, hope is a disposition towards the future from the present in which something or someone is a kind of guarantor. Secondly, hope is always an option, dependent upon our free will and choice. In this lecture, I want to try and dig around what hope might be and explore how it operates in a way which is not only accessible to mainstream Christians like myself. We'll certainly encounter Jewish and Christian themes along the way, and it's very hard to discuss this topic without consciously entering the realms of metaphysics or belief. But it is my assertion that an ability to hope is as fundamental to the human condition as the gift of conscience. So, some ground rules. In trying to examine hope itself, it might be helpful to begin with an observation taken from theological method. The tradition of negative theology argues that it's easier to say what God is not than to say what God is. You'll get caught in fewer traps, be less likely to commit idolatry, if you begin defining what we mean by the word God in the negative. The negative qualifies the positive, which is to say, for example, that God is eternal, whilst not being an endless thing. It's easier to address what hope is not than it is to define clearly what hope is. First, hope is not optimism. Terry Eagleton refers to this view as somehow buying hope on the cheap. Optimism is a shallower form of expectancy. It's a sense that things will proceed and end well, requiring little in the way of any worked-out commitment. Secondly, hope is not positivity. Eagleton again. In a kind of moral astigmatism, one skews the truth to fit one's own natural proclivities, which have already taken all the vital decisions on your behalf. Hope is not something intimately reliant on the subjective, and does not necessarily depend on, for example, an increasingly evident positive trajectory. Thirdly, according to Terry Eagleton, hope is not quite the same as desire. Desire, he says, tends to revolve around a sense of lack, whilst hope mixes disquiet with a degree of tense expectancy. Desire tends to spring out of the guts or the heart, the interior of the body as the Hebrew Bible portrays it, whereas hope is also often simultaneously an activity of the mind as well as the heart, which can be cultivated by practice and self-discipline. Hope is a virtue. So not optimism, not positivity, and not desire. Perhaps we might also say not certainty. This is a precise position, theologically speaking, because hope, as a theological virtue, is carefully allied to faith, which is most certainly a form of confidence which leads to a shaped life, but not certainty. Certainty demands particular external verification, proofs, if you like, which stand up for themselves and make the conclusion an obvious or inevitable one. St. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, puts it characteristically bluntly, hope which is seen is not hope, for who hopes in what they can see? Hope needs commitment, or as Paul helpfully explains in the following verse, eagerness with expectancy. So with all my caveats about how it's easier to explain what hope is not, were we to risk a definition at this stage of what hope is, we might say that it's an activity of human agency, orientated to the future, convicted by deep truth, which is not contingent on other indicators, not reliant on what is seen. Jürgen Moltmann was born in 1926. He was conscripted into the German army in 1944, where he served for a year until the defeat of the Nazis. For 3 years, he was a prisoner of war and dealt with increasing remorse and despair as the truth emerged about the Holocaust. During his imprisonment, he began increasingly to identify with the Christian faith. After his release, a period of activism and postgraduate study within the context of a devastated Germany culminated in his seminal and highly influential theological treatise of 1964, simply entitled Theology of Hope. In this book, Moltmann argues that theology sets out from hope and considers all things in the light of eschatology, that is, the last things. Throughout the New Testament, he highlights, Christian hope is a hoping against hope, precisely because Christian hope is directed towards that which is not yet visible. Faith rests on hope, and indeed there is a kind of mutuality between the two. Writing with the confidence of his own Christian conviction, without faith's knowledge of Christ, he argues, hope becomes a utopia and remains hanging in the air. He continues, to believe means to cross over in hope and anticipate the bounds that have been penetrated by the raising of the crucified. Moltmann's work on hope pushes extraordinary boundaries on the nature of God, theologies of history and providence, and God's engagement with the world. But for us, several things matter most at this stage. Firstly, whilst hope is a starting point from which to consider other questions, theologically, philosophically, politically, it is simultaneously focused on an end point which is promised. Again, it is hope in something. Moltmann speaks of the nearness of God, which we can know through participating in the life of the world as Jesus participated in it. Such living, as it were, shrinks the distance between us and the end. The end can be now. Secondly, things that are not become possible, or in his terms, thinkable, precisely because they are hoped for. The third essential point is Moltmann's context, writing as one reeling from the horrors of Nazi ideology and trying to deal with the problem of suffering. He once posed the question to himself, "How can you hope after Auschwitz?" His reply to himself was simply, "How can you not?" Simple actions of ordinary people who get the true vocation of humanity, revealed for Moltmann in the Jewish people and in the life of the Church, show us God's real purposes for the world. He writes, "Hopes and anticipations of the future are not a transfiguring glow superimposed upon a darkened existence, but are realistic ways of perceiving the scope of our real possibilities." In his Gore lecture here, nearly 60 years later, Moltmann began with a quote from the poet Friedrich Hölderlin, "Where there is danger, salvation also grows." So there is a confidence in this writing, born of the insights of Moltmann's Christian faith, but also honed through the experience of war and post-war imprisonment. But for others, it is precisely the real possibilities of human violence and human capriciousness which make hope hard to define and even harder to engage in. It is 75 years since the liberation of Auschwitz. Much of what is often described as Holocaust literature wrestles with hope in the face of intractable odds, as well as with the more ultimate questions which arise from horrors such as these. Is it possible to speak not only of hope, but of God? And if so, what kind of God? Many Jewish writers wrestled with the covenant itself, some even suggesting that the extremity of the Shoah represented God's own breach of the covenant. Yitzhak Greenberg insisted that the Holocaust necessarily ushers in a new and different kind of faith. There is some remarkable writing here, holy ground, upon which a non-Jewish theologian treads with immense respect and care. Emil Fackenheim, for example, continued to insist that the Lord was always present in Jewish history, even at Auschwitz. It may not be possible to say how God was present, but present he was. Even from the camps, as from Mount Sinai, God commands Israel. The content of this command, what Fackenheim has called the 614th commandment, there are 613 commandments in traditional Judaism, is that Jews are forbidden to hand Hitler posthumous victories. Holocaust literature, from biographical reports to more elegiac philosophical responses, contains much testimony to the human spirit, or what we might say to the innate, inbuilt human capacity for hope. His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales stood at Yad Vashem this year for the World Holocaust Forum, and in a speech to an audience including survivors, he said, "For that an evil cannot be described does not mean that it cannot be defeated. That it cannot be fully understood does not mean that it cannot be overcome." Prince Charles was not just being poetic. There are seriously important philosophical points here too. Pure rationality and an absolute insistence on certain kinds of hard evidence only get us so far. We may not be able to fully explain in black and white the capacity for evil which experiments on children or plots the deaths of millions. But one theme which emerges so movingly out of the testimony of many Holocaust survivors is a strong sense that this evil cannot represent the deepest truth about humanity, our world, that truth which many of us dare to call God. In fact, an out-of-balance, cold, calculating rationalism, which in practice shuts down the potential for transformation, may be part of the problem which leads to such evil becoming possible. There are other resources humans draw on at times like this. Anita Lasker-Wallfisch, who survived through her membership of the Auschwitz Orchestra, recalled seeing piles of prosthetic limbs in the camp, many of which belonged to Jewish veterans of the First World War who had fought for Germany. Her own father won the Iron Cross during that war. So countless veterans who had fought for Germany were exterminated. When a country systematically slaughters many of those who had previously fought for its freedom, optimism is surely impossible. What rational, broad conclusions might one draw from such facts? It's pretty bleak. And yet, for many who have encountered the sheer fact of brutality during the Holocaust and since, hope is somehow not imprisoned by these categories. The Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel, whose devastating autobiographical novel Night, about life in Auschwitz and Buchenwald, was translated into 30 languages, and he reflected in April 2002 on some of the small chinks of light discernible even amidst such horror. I quote him, "People say occasionally that there must be light at the end of the tunnel, but I believe in those times there was light in the tunnel. The strange way, there was courage in the ghetto. There was hope, human hope, in the death camps. Simply an anonymous prisoner giving a piece of bread to someone who is hungrier than he or she, a father shielding his child, a mother trying to hold back her tears so that children would not see her pain. That was courage." Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist and neurologist imprisoned in Auschwitz, Dachau, and other camps. His extraordinary book, Man's Search for Meaning, is a testimony to his own particular experiences of the Holocaust and also an attempt to draw some tentative philosophical and moral conclusions which relate to hope. One of the many moving stories he recounts is his arrival at Auschwitz. Forfeiting his clothes and therefore losing the manuscript of his first book, he was instead given the worn, used prison uniform of a man who had already been sent to the gas chambers. In the coat pocket, he found a leaf torn out of a Hebrew prayer book, which contained the Shema Yisrael, that most important Jewish prayer. He writes of this moment, "How should I have interpreted such a coincidence, other than as a challenge to live my thoughts rather than put them on paper?" For him, the challenge was to live through this experience as if meaning did not ultimately depend on survival. If that were the case, it would be impossible to posit any final meaning to life. Frankl concludes his work with a frank assessment of the contradiction and complexity in summing up the human contribution to these years. In the camps, he writes, humans could either behave as swine or saints. The decision for either potential was a personal one. Thus, the capacity to live hopefully is a choice. He concludes his work, "Our generation is realistic, for we have come to know man as he truly is. After all, man is that being who invented the gas chambers of Auschwitz. However, he is also that being who entered those gas chambers upright, with the Lord's Prayer or the Shema Yisrael on his lips." One conclusion we might draw from much of this literature is that it is indeed impossible to understand hope as an abstract virtue. It requires courage and personal conviction, and more often than not, a strong activity of the will. But actions which spring from individual personal conviction, the gift of a piece of bread, the father sheltering a child, can overflow and develop a hopeful dynamic which shapes groups and wider communities. In part, this is about how human beings respond to the world of signs, gestures which communicate so much of our day-to-day experience. On the one hand, the passing of a morsel of bread from one individual to another might just look like an ordinary activity. But in the context of starvation and death, such selflessness and generosity takes on a much deeper significance. Actions like this witness to another context, another story. They resonate with a power which is not their own. They speak of a fullness or completeness which seems to tell a more fruitful truth about human purpose and vocation. One of the most influential philosophical voices to emerge from Germany in the 20s and 30s was Hannah Arendt. Briefly imprisoned by the Gestapo, she fled Germany before the outbreak of war, continuing academic research and writing, whilst initially also assisting younger Jews to escape to Palestine. Famously, she covered the end of Adolf Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem, coining the controversial phrase, the banality of evil, to describe Eichmann's role in the Nazi genocide. Writing around roughly the same time as Moltmann in the early 1960s, it's not surprising that Arendt dismissed the myth of societal progress as a serious danger. Similarly, she argued, there is nothing inevitable about history. Progress, she says, seems to function in modernity as an ultimate, with optimism working as a penultimate. That is simply not sufficient. In 1968, she published a book called Men in Dark Times. Written over a period of 12 years, Arendt assembles a diverse cast who have very little in common with one another, and whom, she says, hardly knew one another. The first half of the 20th century is their age, with one exception, with its political catastrophes and moral disasters. And the book's title is borrowed from Bertolt Brecht's poem To Posterity. By way of introduction, she writes, "Dark times are not only not new, they are no rarity in history. That even in the darkest times, we have the right to expect some illumination, which may well come less from theories and concepts than from the uncertain, flickering and often weak light that some men and women in their lives and their works will kindle under almost all circumstances." Her second chapter is focused on Rosa Luxemburg, a communist intellectual murdered by the ultra-nationalist Freikorps, from which, Arendt tells us, Hitler later recruited some of his worst killers. Rosa Luxemburg warned against the worst excesses of the Russian Revolution so strongly that her memory was defamed. Chapter 3 recalls Angelo Roncalli, Pope St. John the 23rd, a chapter she subtitles A Christian on the Throne of St. Peter. His reluctance to undergo episcopal ordination, his calling of the Second Vatican Council, his detachment from the need for approval, his greeting of a Jewish delegation with the words, "I am your brother, Joseph," and his pioneering ecumenical spirit are all listed as signs of light in dark times. The philosopher, poet, and critic Hermann Broch is the subject of the 7th chapter. His epic career spanned both world wars, and at the end of a fulsome account of his intellectual achievements, Arendt simply writes, "For Broch, all relationships are ultimately governed by the idea of helpfulness. Men's claim to help from one another is never-ending and inexhaustible. Just as Broch took it for granted that he must instantly lay aside any work, any activity, in order to give help where it was needed, so he ultimately took it for granted that he must lay aside literature, because he couldn't see how it could take the leap from knowledge of what is needed to help for those in need." You'll be glad to hear I shan't go on with other examples. Each of Arendt's characters stand out against the tide. They push, one way or another, either from the center or from the margins, against the broader trend. They're quirky individuals whose goodness or humor or humility or way of being disrupts the current and reveals richer truth, ultimate priority. She assumes through the title of her book that these are witnesses in the darkness. As one commentator has put it, to know such a person in a moment of despair is to witness hope before one's eyes. This kind of hope is not a system or an idea, but a human face. It's clear, I assume from what I've said so far, that hope is a virtue practiced by individuals or revealed in relationships between individuals. It might seem unrealistic to contract out the act of hope to others as such, but anyone who has ever held a hand at a deathbed might rightly disagree. The actions, presence, or words of others, even that which in its own context might seem mundane, can overflow so that others draw hope from such occasions. Advocacy is a key ingredient of sustaining hope when times are hard. That gift of bread, or the sheltering of a child in the concentration camp, those are acts of advocacy. They repristinate the dynamics of human relationships, calling the best out of us through mundane acts. Choosing to share in the hope of another, or allowing oneself to be implicated in another person's hope, even when one cannot feel such hope oneself, is an acceptance of the interconnectedness of the world and an acknowledgement of one's place within ongoing networks of possibility. The COVID-19 pandemic emerged onto the international stage at a moment already beset by dizzying social, environmental, and political fragmentation. Jonathan Sachs well describes this movement of so many of our tectonic plates as cultural climate change, which is already having a transformative effect on individual day-to-day life and the geopolitical arena. The nations of the world are at war in the midst of peace, argued Professor Moltmann in this year's Gore lecture, reflecting on the problems of neo-nationalism and cyber wars. Introduce into this new equation a pandemic, a trauma as ancient as human history, but played out in the context of fast-shifting global sands. To add to that cocktail, in much of the West, this is the first pandemic of what is often described as a secular age. No longer is there much sense, in the UK at least, that this is divine judgment or a set test, rather a near inevitable fruit of globalization, mass travel, and large-scale infection. When the Chinese politician Zhou Enlai was asked for his assessment of the consequences of the French Revolution on its 200th anniversary, he famously replied that it was far too soon to tell. We don't quite know how this virus will reshape the world, but we do know that our resources for dealing with it are not quite the same as in previous ages, and that it will affect all sorts of things we take for granted. The danger of mass infection affects not just travel, but touch. Not just the health of our economy, but our mental health. Not just the essential provision of food, but the sustaining potential of the arts and culture to enlarge our vision. A crisis on this scale resets our questions rather dramatically. Will travel bubbles become hermetically sealed safe zones for those who can afford them? Will quarantine encourage us to relate only to people like us, at the expense of diversity and the voices of those all too frequently excluded? Could education remain something that we do alone or online? Will we allow a subtle but potentially devastating turn, which assumes nature to be our enemy, only to be controlled, monitored, and dominated, rather than treated with reverence in the spirit of partnership? To answer all these questions as a society, we need public signs of hope and recovery, which takes seriously what people have lost, whilst also interrogating new ways of doing things. Public hope needs to get beyond media strategies and headlines and be considered a priority in every act of policymaking and public engagement. And where better to begin that project of public hope than to reflect on where we have seen signs of hope during this pandemic? This can't strictly be analysed on a hard, soft playing field. Both economic ingenuity and emotional intelligence will be key. For many, the government's furlough scheme has been a great sign of hope. But alongside budgetary and economic solutions, we need to realise that straightforward human gifts of nurture, care, inspiration, and mutuality need to be right at the heart of our recovery. Society has not been closed during this period. Rather, we have seen the sinews at the heart of our society working at full tilt. We've seen in our lives and on our screens what can so often be hidden. Key workers in healthcare, food provision, and so many other areas committing to public health and public life before their own. Hope has often come to our country from those who themselves are tired, vulnerable, scapegoated, under-rewarded. You might forgive a theologian for suggesting that love can be a political and social force if we choose it to be. As I said earlier, hope is not optimism, or glib positivity. It is perfectly possible to be honest in assessing where things have gone wrong and still be hopeful. In fact, an honest assessment is a good place to start. Hope can be a fruit of a very deep disquiet. To borrow from Jürgen Moltmann, new futures become thinkable or possible precisely because they are hoped for. The question of how groups or institutions can be hopeful, strictly speaking, is a difficult one. If hope is a virtue, are groups capable of developing a personality through which such virtue might be sustained? It seems anachronistic to us to think of nation-states as possessing a moral personality, although many great thinkers of the past certainly believed this to be possible and indeed desirable. Institutions, their governing structures and participants, can structure themselves to promote hope alongside any other virtues. But ultimately, hope needs a decision and an agency. So in political terms, this means both leadership and subsidiarity. In order for groups or institutions to be hopeful, they need some kind of common narrative and a shape and purpose which is given by inspirational leadership which serves the common good and celebrates possibilities beyond the immediately deliverable. It needs commitment. This may come in different forms. A shared understanding of the common good and a shared intent which is underpinned by law, custom, or value, often making that which is implicit explicit, is one way for a society to pursue this. But that still relies on the participation of individuals and either a strong sense of religious or moral mutuality on the one hand, or social or professional contracts on the other to hold it all together. It may well be that hope, rather than being understood as a net result of such organizing processes, can also help sustain and improve societies or organizations more generally. Hopefulness engenders humility, because the object of hope is never something which we can fully control. There is a necessary handing over involved in the act of hope, to God, to providence, to the future, to the agency of others. A hopeful culture or a hopeful organization will have at its heart a trustworthiness which can encourage those moves. Precisely because of this humility and handing over, hope should be a virtue which interrupts and disturbs us. It doesn't allow us to withdraw when disagreements become intractable. It doesn't allow us resignation or despair. Hope reminds us that we cannot come to absolute conclusions quite yet. So hope may also be part of the glue which allows a society to disagree well and to seek the common good despite disagreement. So to conclude, hope is an activity of the human heart and mind. It is a conscious choice, an act of freedom and of virtue to be honed. It is also a moral choice, signifying what we believe about the nature of creation and ultimate purpose. It helps us see how history is an ongoing act, not a series of individual, unrelated scenes. In his Gore lecture a few months ago, Professor Moltmann said, "We do not know whether humankind will survive its self-induced destiny and be able to liberate itself from suicide traps. And that is a good thing. If we knew we had no chance of surviving, we would do nothing about our predicament. If we knew that we were definitely going to survive, we wouldn't do anything either." His lecture was a call to action, responding to various crises of our time with a resolute culture of life. Hope needs agency. A decision has to be made, and priority given to that which is not necessarily crudely demonstrable. Like faith and love, the other two theological virtues, hope can't be seen and is not determined. It is called out from within us and may well be judged by external criteria as illogical. But logic can be a prison of its own making, and in interrogating hope, we will not get far unless we consider questions of ultimate purpose and meaning. What are humans made for? And of what are they capable? That's why Hannah Arendt's Men in Dark Times matters. It's why we need our heroes, the hidden key workers, and the better angels of our culture to wake us up, to make us expectant, and to realize our potential. In his new book, Morality, Lord Sachs argues that there may well be an empirical basis for committing to hope. He writes, "There exists within nature and humanity an astonishing range of powers to heal what has been harmed and mend what has been broken. These powers are embedded within life itself, with its creativity and capacity for self-renewal. That is the empirical basis of hope. Nature favors species able to recover, and history favors cultures that can do so." End quote. At the end of the day, hope is a free choice, and a dynamic which we can curate for one another at moments when our own agency feels exhausted or powerless. Hope stops us shutting off our own potential and calls out of us new possibilities, new vision. It allows communities to be formed and reformed on the basis of new vision. We frequently learn about hope from situations of seeming despair or confusion as someone steps forward, the martyr, the aid worker, the marginalized person, and refuses to be bound by the trudge or the tyranny of the seemingly inevitable. Where there is danger, salvation also grows.